Some objects survive because they are valuable. Others survive because no one can get rid of them. Across centuries in different countries, among people who never knew one another, the same pattern keeps appearing. A sacred gem is removed from its origin. A sealed box is opened. A ritual object is taken out of the place where it was meant to remain. And then, almost as if history itself reacts, the consequences begin. Illness, fire, ruin, nightmares, sudden death. Maybe all of it is coincidence. Maybe fear is enough to make ordinary events feel connected. But when the same structure repeats again and again, across cultures that share no language, no religion, and no common folklore, the question becomes much harder to dismiss. At what point does a legend stop sounding like superstition and start sounding like a warning? Tonight, we are looking at 10 artifacts that were never meant to be treated as decoration, trophies, or collectibles. Each one carries a history darker than the object itself. And the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to believe these are just stories. We begin with perhaps the most famous cursed jewel in the world. Top 1, the Hope Diamond. The Hope Diamond is usually presented as a masterpiece of nature, a rare blue gemstone admired behind museum glass, studied for its beauty, its age, and its chemical uniqueness. But long before it became a display piece, it carried a reputation far darker than luxury. Its story does not begin in a gallery or royal vault. It begins with removal, with the idea that something sacred could be cut loose from its original world and turned into property. That is where the unease begins, and once it begins, it never really stops. The diamond is believed to trace back to India, where the original rough stone was said to have been taken from a sacred idol. Whether every part of that origin story is historically provable matters less than what followed it, because from the moment the gem entered circulation, people began attaching disaster to its path. French merchant Jean-Baptiste Tavernier brought the stone to Europe in the 17th century, and stories of his violent death helped establish the earliest whispers that the diamond brought ruin to those who possessed it. Over time, the stone entered the orbit of royalty, was recut into the French blue, and eventually passed through the hands of kings and aristocrats whose fates would later be remembered not for triumph, but for humiliation, collapse, and death. Louis XV, Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette. Different roles, different moments in history, yet all absorbed into the growing mythology of a jewel that seemed to leave destruction behind it. Centuries later, the same pattern appeared again in modern society. In 1911, Evelyn Walsh McLean wore the newly acquired 45.52-carat Hope Diamond as if it were the ultimate symbol of status. She entered elite rooms glittering with confidence, convinced that she possessed something extraordinary. She was right, just not in the way she imagined. Within a decade, her family was shattered. Her son was killed in a car accident. Her daughter later died by suicide. Her husband descended into mental collapse. The diamond remained, but the life around it did not. That sequence deepened the legend because it made the curse feel less like an old royal myth and more like something that could still function in the modern world. And the pattern kept expanding. Other owners were tied to bankruptcies, institutionalizations, murders, and sudden reversals of fortune. A Turkish sultan reportedly gave the jewel to a concubine who was later killed. A banker obtained it and lost everything within months. Each story strengthened the same terrifying idea. The stone did not care whether its owner was a king, a collector, a socialite, or a financier. It only seemed to demand that eventually something irreplaceable would be taken. Even now, sitting at the Smithsonian, officially dismissed as merely a geological marvel, the Hope Diamond still feels less like a treasure than a warning preserved under glass. Because if it is only a diamond, then why has its history become a chain of grief stretching across empires, families, and generations? And why does every new owner, no matter how educated or powerful, always believe the pattern will end with them? Top 2, the Dybbuk box. The object did not look dangerous. When it first appeared at an estate sale in Portland, Oregon, it was just a small wooden wine cabinet, about 10 inches tall, with brass handles and faint Hebrew inscriptions carved into its surface. There was nothing about it that suggested anything unusual. No markings that signaled danger. No visible damage. Nothing that would make someone hesitate. except for one thing. The woman selling it, a Holocaust survivor, gave a warning that immediately changed how the box was perceived. She said it should never be opened. According to her, the cabinet contained a Dybbuk, a restless spirit from Jewish folklore, believed to attach itself to objects and follow the living. The statement sounded extreme, almost theatrical. It was easy to dismiss. And that is exactly what happened. The buyer, Kevin Mannis, took the box home along with several other items, treating it like a curiosity rather than something to be taken seriously. But not long after, small things began to happen. Subtle at first, almost explainable. A strange smell lingered around the box, something like cat urine that refused to disappear no matter how thoroughly it was cleaned. Electrical devices in the house began malfunctioning. Lights flickered without reason. Doors opened on their own. These were the kinds of events people could ignore, or rationalize, or simply choose not to connect. Then the dream started. Mannis described vivid nightmares in which an old woman appeared, attacking him while whispering in a language he did not understand. The dreams were intense, physical, repetitive. And what made them more disturbing was what came later. Other owners, people who had never met him, who had no contact with him, would later describe almost the exact same dream. The same figure, the same pressure, the same feeling of being pinned down while something unseen watched from just beyond the edge of consciousness. Eventually, Mannis opened the box. Inside, there was nothing that looked threatening. A dried rosebud, a lock of hair, a granite statue, a gold wine goblet. Ordinary objects, harmless at least on the surface. But shortly after opening it, Mannis experienced a sudden medical episode that resembled a stroke, temporarily impairing his vision and speech. On the same day, his mother, who had only briefly handled the box, suffered a severe health crisis. The timing was too precise to ignore, yet still too unclear to explain. He decided to get rid of it. The box was sold online, accompanied by a detailed warning describing everything that had happened. But passing it on did not end the pattern. Each new owner reported something different, yet strangely similar in structure. Sudden anxiety, hair loss, swarms of flies appearing and disappearing without explanation. The same recurring nightmare. Again and again, people tried to discard the box, and again, they claimed it returned or resisted being thrown away, as if it was less an object and more a presence that refused to be abandoned. Skeptics argue that the Dybbuk box is nothing more than a modern legend, a case of suggestion amplified by the internet. And under normal circumstances, that explanation would be enough. But what makes this case difficult to dismiss is not a single story. It is the consistency, the same symptoms, the same dream, the same sequence of events repeating across people who had no reason to influence one another. If this is just a box made of wood and metal, then why does everyone who owns it describe the same experience, in the same way? And more importantly, why does it seem so difficult for anyone to truly get rid of it? Top 3, the Delhi Purple Sapphire. Some cursed objects inspire fear because of what they look like. This one did not. The Delhi Purple Sapphire was not enormous, not visually overwhelming, and not obviously sinister. In fact, it was not even a true sapphire. Mineralogists would later identify it as an amethyst, a gemstone that, from a scientific perspective, was ordinary, stable, and harmless. But what made this stone frightening was never its composition. It was the trail of collapse that seemed to form around it, as though every attempt to possess it pulled another life into the same downward spiral. Its story begins in 1857 during the Indian Rebellion, a period already saturated with violence, chaos, and rupture. A British cavalry officer, Colonel W. Ferris, removed the violet gem from a temple associated with the Hindu god Indra and brought it back to England as a war trophy. That detail matters because, from the beginning, the stone was not acquired through inheritance or trade in the ordinary sense. It was taken, removed from a sacred setting and repurposed as a possession. And from that moment forward, nearly every account attached to it begins to shift in tone. The language becomes less about ownership and more about warning. Soon after returning to England, Ferris suffered financial ruin and a rapid decline in health. When he died, the stone passed to his eldest son, who treated it as a family treasure rather than a danger. but the result was nearly identical. He lost his business, fell into chronic illness, and spent the rest of his life in poverty. At that stage, it would still have been easy to call it coincidence. Families collapse, businesses fail, people get sick. History is full of tragedies that need no supernatural explanation. But the stone kept moving, and each time it did, the same pattern returned. Eventually, it came into the possession of Edward Heron Allen, a respected British scientist, writer, and collector, known for his rational mind and deep skepticism. If anyone was likely to dismiss the stone's reputation, it was him. At first, he did exactly that. He treated it as a strange curiosity, perhaps a cultural object burdened by superstition. But not long after accepting it, the atmosphere around him began to shift. Members of his household suffered anxiety, sleep disturbances, and a persistent sense of unease. He tried to give the gem away. The first recipient returned it after repeated accidents and financial trouble. The second, a professional singer, abruptly lost her voice and was forced to abandon her career. Two separate people, two separate lives, the same refusal of the stone to remain anywhere for long without consequence. Desperate to break the pattern, Heron Allen threw the gemstone into London's Regent's Canal. It should have disappeared. Instead, it came back, recovered during routine dredging, sold onward, and eventually traced right back to him. That seems to have been the moment his skepticism gave way to fear. His letters changed in tone. He stopped describing the gem as unusual and began referring to it as dangerous. By 1904, he became convinced that it was affecting his infant daughter, whose breathing became irregular, whose sleep was disturbed, whose distress would not ease. Fearing that the object posed a real threat, he sealed it inside a protective container, locked it in a bank vault, and left written instructions that it was not to be opened until 33 years after his death. He also included a warning that the stone was stained with blood and should be thrown into the sea by anyone who handled it. That is what makes this case so unsettling. Not simply the tragedies, but the transformation of the people involved. A military officer took it as a trophy. A son kept it as an heirloom. A scientist accepted it as a curiosity. And one by one, all of them moved from possession to fear. Today, the stone remains in museum care, cataloged, explained, chemically ordinary. But if it was truly nothing more than a mislabeled amethyst, why did a man trained to trust evidence become so certain that it had to be sealed away from the world? And what happened in that house that convinced him never to let it touch another life again? Top 4. The Crying Boy Painting. Not every cursed object is rare. Some become terrifying precisely because they are ordinary. That is what made the Crying Boy painting so disturbing. It was not a one-of-a-kind masterpiece hidden in a private vault. It was a mass-produced print, inexpensive, familiar, and widely sold in ordinary homes. It hung on walls in living rooms, hallways, and staircases, surrounded by everyday life. That should have made it harmless. Instead, it made the pattern harder to ignore, because when fear began to gather around this painting, it was not happening in one isolated place. It was happening over and over again, in home after home, among people who had never met each other. The image itself was simple: a sorrowful young boy, eyes wet with tears, staring directly at the viewer. It was created by Italian artist Bruno Amadio under the name Giovanni Bragolin and became especially popular in British households during the 1970s and 1980s. There was nothing about it, at least at first glance, that suggested danger. It looked sentimental, even decorative. But in 1985, after a wave of house fires swept through northern England, firefighters and homeowners began noticing something that gave the painting an entirely different meaning. Again and again, after flames had consumed furniture, curtains, carpets, and entire rooms, the same image was found still intact. Not merely less damaged than surrounding objects, but sometimes almost perfectly preserved. No serious burns, no obvious smoke damage. In some cases, it was found face down among the rubble, untouched while everything else had become ash. At first, that kind of detail sounds like the sort of thing people exaggerate after tragedy. But what changed the story was repetition. Different towns, different families, different causes of fire, And yet the same object kept reappearing in the aftermath, like a witness that refused to be destroyed. Firefighters began talking among themselves, quietly at first, then more openly. One anonymously quoted officer reportedly claimed he had seen the same painting survive 5 separate fires. Whether every retelling was perfectly accurate almost stops mattering at that point, because the myth was no longer built on a single event. It was built on accumulation. Each new fire attached itself to all the ones before it until the painting no longer seemed decorative at all. It began to feel like a signature. Then the press got involved. In September 1985, a British tabloid ran the story under a headline that helped turn unease into national hysteria. Suddenly, the crying boy was not just a strange surviving print. It was the cursed painting. Public fear escalated quickly. Homeowners began blaming it not only for fires, but for streaks of bad luck, illness, job losses, and deaths within the family. One woman said the painting fell from the wall the same night her husband died of a stroke. Another returned it after the sudden death of her cat. Whether those events were connected or not, the emotional logic was already in place. Once people believed the painting carried misfortune, every tragedy near it started to feel like proof. Authorities did attempt a rational explanation. Investigators suggested that the prints may have been produced on fire-resistant hardboard and coated with varnish that allowed them to survive longer than expected. That theory makes sense on paper, but it never fully answered the question that kept haunting the public. Why this painting so consistently? Why not dozens of other mass-produced prints from the same era? Why did this one image develop such a specific and repeated association with destruction? A technical explanation may have explained survival in a single incident. It did not fully explain the pattern that had already settled into people's minds. Eventually, the fear became so intense that hundreds of these paintings were collected and burned in a public bonfire, as though destroying the image in mass could destroy the story attached to it. But the story did not disappear. Copies continued to surface in thrift stores, attics, abandoned homes, and forgotten rooms, often still in remarkably good condition. And that is what makes the Crying Boy painting so effective as a legend. It does not need to chase anyone. It only needs to survive. Because if this was only a cheap print, then why did it keep turning up after disaster, as though it had been spared for a reason? And why, out of everything fire could leave behind, was it always the crying child that remained to look back? Top 5. The Uluru Rock Fragment. Some objects are not meant to be owned at all, not because they are rare or fragile or historically valuable, but because they belong to a place in a way that cannot be separated without consequence. The Uluru rock fragments are one of the clearest examples of this idea. Individually, each piece is small, unremarkable, often no larger than a hand, but together they carry something that does not seem to fade with distance, time, or explanation. Uluru, the massive sandstone formation in central Australia, is not just a natural landmark. For the Anangu people, it is a sacred site woven into stories, law, and identity. Every part of it is connected to meaning, and removing even a small fragment is not seen as collecting a souvenir, but as breaking a relationship that was never meant to be broken. Despite this, for decades, visitors took pieces of the rock home, often without fully understanding what they were taking. At the time, it felt harmless, a physical memory of a journey, something to keep, something to own. Then the pattern began. Tourists who had taken fragments started reporting an unusual chain of misfortune. Accidents, sudden illness, financial collapse, relationship breakdowns. Some described an ongoing sense of anxiety that would not disappear. Others spoke about vivid dreams tied to the place they had left behind. At first, these accounts were scattered and easy to dismiss. Travel can be stressful, life is unpredictable. But as years passed, the number of similar stories grew to a point where it could no longer be ignored. The details changed from person to person, but the structure remained the same. Something was taken, and something in return seemed to be lost. Eventually, the fragments began coming back. Packages started arriving at parks' offices and cultural centers, boxes filled with small pieces of stone, each accompanied by handwritten letters. Some were brief, almost apologetic. Others were long, emotional, and detailed. People described years of bad luck that they believed began the moment they removed the rock. One letter spoke about a series of accidents that nearly killed the sender. Another described a complete financial collapse, followed by illness in the family. Some writers did not claim certainty, but they did not want to take the risk anymore. Returning the fragment felt like the only way to restore balance, even if they could not explain how that balance had been broken. What makes this case different from others is that there is no single object, no single artifact that carries a story. There are thousands of fragments scattered across the world, each one tied to a personal narrative that often follows the same arc. Take something that was not yours, experience a shift that cannot be clearly explained, and eventually feel the need to undo the act, even if it means admitting that something beyond logic might be involved. Skeptics argue that this is a powerful example of suggestion, that once people learn a place is sacred, guilt and expectation can shape how they interpret events in their lives. That explanation is reasonable, but it still leaves one question behind. Why do so many people across different countries and cultures arrive at the same decision independently? They return the stone. Because whether the cause is psychological, cultural, or something else entirely, the outcome is always the same. Keeping the fragment feels wrong, and giving it back feels like the only way to make things stop. So if these are just pieces of sandstone, why does distance never seem to separate them from the place they came from? And why do so many people feel that the only way to escape what followed them is to send it home? Top 6. The Maori warrior mask. Some objects are created to be seen, others are created to be felt. The Maori warrior masks, often carved with intense expressions, wide eyes, and protruding tongues, were never meant to be decorative pieces displayed for curiosity. They were part of a living cultural system, tied to identity, protection, and spiritual presence. Each carving carried meaning, and in many cases, it was believed to hold a form of energy connected to those who created it and those who used it. Removing such an object from that context was not simply relocation, it was separation from purpose. Many of these masks eventually found their way into private collections, antique markets, and museums around the world. To a collector, they were striking works of art. To historians, they were cultural artifacts. But to the communities they came from, they were never just objects. And that difference in perception may explain why the stories attached to them began to follow a very specific pattern. Some of the most persistent accounts involve women who handled or kept the masks in private spaces. According to multiple reports, exposure to certain masks was believed to bring misfortune, particularly affecting fertility or causing unexplained illness. Whether interpreted as a spiritual reaction or a cultural boundary being crossed, the result was the same. People who came into contact with the mask began to experience disturbances that were difficult to trace back to a clear cause. In several documented cases, collectors reported sudden shifts in atmosphere within their homes, a feeling of being watched, unusual sounds at night, objects moving or falling without clear explanation. Some described recurring dreams involving figures they did not recognize, often accompanied by a sense of pressure or fear that lingered long after waking. Others experienced prolonged anxiety that seemed to center around the presence of the mask itself, as if the object was not passive, but actively influencing the environment around it. Museums, over time, began to take these concerns seriously, not necessarily as proof of anything supernatural, but as recognition that these objects carried cultural significance that could not be ignored. Some institutions placed restrictions on who could handle certain items. Others displayed them with contextual warnings, acknowledging that they were not simply art, but part of a belief system that continued to exist. In some cases, requests were made for the return of these masks to their communities of origin, where they could be restored to the role they were intended to serve. What makes the Maori warrior mask different from other items on this list is that the warning does not come only after something happens. It exists from the beginning. The meaning is already embedded in the object, long before it is removed, sold, or displayed. The consequences, if they appear, do not feel random. They feel like the result of something being taken out of balance. Skeptics may argue that these experiences are shaped by expectation, that once people are told an object carries meaning, their perception begins to change. That is a valid point, But it still leaves a deeper question unanswered. Why do so many of these objects, taken from entirely different places, cultures, and traditions, seem to respond in the same way when they are removed from where they belong? And if the mask was never meant to be separated from its origin, then what exactly continues to follow it, long after it has been taken away? Top 7. The Japanese Temple Mirror. Mirrors are not supposed to keep anything, they reflect. They show what is in front of them, and when the moment passes, they return to stillness, holding nothing. But in many traditions, especially in parts of Japan, mirrors were never seen as empty surfaces. They were treated as objects that could capture presence, preserve intention, and sometimes act as a boundary between what is visible and what is not. In temples and shrines, mirrors were often used in rituals not because they revealed something new, but because they were believed to reflect truth without distortion. And that is where the unease begins. Because if a mirror can reflect truth, what happens when something else is left behind in that reflection? The mirror associated with this story was said to have been removed from a temple environment, separated from the ritual context that once defined its purpose. At first, it behaved like any ordinary object. It was displayed, handled, and treated as a cultural piece rather than something active. But over time, subtle irregularities began to appear. People who spent extended time near it reported a growing discomfort, a feeling that was difficult to describe, but impossible to ignore. It was not immediate fear. It was slower, quieter, a sense that something was not quite aligned. Then came the visual anomalies. Some observers claimed that their reflection did not always move in perfect synchronization. Slight delays, small inconsistencies, movements that seemed to occur just a fraction of a second too late, or not at all. These details were easy to question, easy to dismiss as tricks of perception. Mirrors are known to distort under certain lighting conditions. The human brain fills gaps, misinterprets angles, creates patterns that are not really there. But what made these accounts difficult to ignore was that they were not isolated. Different individuals at different times described nearly identical experiences. The disturbances did not end with what could be seen. People began reporting changes in sleep patterns, restlessness, recurring dreams in which they stood in front of the same mirror, but the reflection did not belong to them. In some cases, the figure in the reflection appeared to watch them even after they had turned away. The dreams were not violent, they were not dramatic, but they carried a quiet intensity that made them difficult to forget. And when those dreams repeated night after night, the line between imagination and experience began to blur. Eventually, the mirror was returned, not because of a single incident, but because of accumulation. The same patterns seen in other artifacts began to appear here as well. Discomfort, repetition, a growing sense that the object was not passive. When it was placed back into a temple setting, the report stopped. The disturbances ended. The environment returned to normal, at least according to those who had been affected. That resolution, simple as it sounds, is what gives the story its weight. Because if the experiences were purely psychological, tied only to belief or suggestion, why would returning the object to its original context bring such a consistent sense of relief? Skeptics argue that the mind is powerful enough to create these effects, especially when influenced by cultural expectations. And that is true, but it still leaves a question that is harder to resolve. Why do these experiences often begin only after the object is removed from where it was meant to be? And why do they seem to end the moment it is returned? If a mirror is only a surface, then it should not matter where it is placed. So what exactly was it reflecting when it was no longer where it belonged? Top 8. The Basano vase. Some objects are not feared because of what they do. They are feared because of what follows them. The Basano vase is one of those objects. At first glance, it appears elegant, almost delicate. A silver vessel, finely crafted, associated with wealth, status, and tradition. There is nothing in its design that suggests danger. No symbols, no warnings, no visible damage. And yet, from the moment it entered recorded history, it carried a story that never seemed to change. Whoever owned it did not keep it for long. According to legend, the vase originated in 15th century Italy. It was said to have been given as a wedding gift to a young bride. On what should have been the beginning of a new life, something went wrong. She died on the night of her wedding under circumstances that were never clearly explained. The vase, still in her possession, became the first link in a chain of events that would repeat across generations. It was inherited, passed down, and each time it changed hands, the same pattern seemed to follow. Sudden death, unexpected loss, a life interrupted without warning. As the story spread, the vase became less of an heirloom and more of a burden. Families who received it did not celebrate its arrival. They questioned it. Some tried to keep it hidden. Others attempted to pass it on as quickly as possible, as if distance alone could break whatever connection had formed around it. But distance did not seem to matter. The accounts continued. Owners died within months. Some suffered accidents. Others experienced illness that appeared without warning and progressed too quickly to understand. Each new case added another layer to the legend, reinforcing the same idea. The object did not bring immediate harm, but it never allowed stability to last. Eventually, the fear became too strong to ignore. One family reportedly decided to seal the vase inside a lead box, accompanied by a written warning that it should never be opened. For a time, that seemed to work. The object disappeared from circulation. The stories faded, but years later the box was discovered, opened by individuals who had no knowledge of what it contained. And with that, the pattern began again. Whether those later events are fully documented or shaped by retelling is difficult to determine. But the structure of the story remained intact. The vase returned, and the consequences returned with it. In modern accounts, the Basano vase is often described as missing, its exact location unknown. That detail, whether true or not, adds another layer of tension. Because unlike objects displayed in museums or locked away in controlled environments, this one is said to be unaccounted for. Somewhere, possibly still moving from one owner to another, quietly continuing the same sequence it has followed for centuries. Skeptics point out that many elements of this story rely on legend rather than verifiable records. And that is true. But even legends have structure, and this one has remained remarkably consistent. An object enters a life, time passes, and then something irreversible happens. If the vase is only silver, shaped by human hands, then it should behave like any other object. So why does every version of its story end the same way? And if it truly has no power at all, why did so many people decide it was safer to lock it away than to keep it? Top 9. The terracotta cursed figurine. Some objects do not carry fear because of their history. They carry fear because of what they seem to represent. The terracotta figurine in this case was small, easily overlooked, and at first glance, almost insignificant. It did not come from a royal collection or a famous excavation. It was not widely known, not displayed in major institutions, and not associated with a single dramatic event. And yet, over time, it became linked to a series of experiences that were difficult to explain and even harder to dismiss. The figurine was believed to originate from an ancient burial site, possibly part of a ritual practice intended to accompany the dead. Objects like this were not decorative. They were functional within a belief system, placed with intention, often meant to serve a role that extended beyond the physical world. Removing such an object from its original setting may seem harmless from a modern perspective, but within the context it came from, that act could be interpreted as a disruption of something carefully structured. After its discovery, the figurine entered private hands. At that point, it was treated as a curiosity, something unusual but not necessarily dangerous. That perception began to change when the first reports surfaced. The owner described a persistent feeling of unease that centered around the object. It was not constant, but it returned at specific times, often late at night, when the surrounding environment was quiet. Shadows seemed to shift in ways that did not match the available light. Small sounds appeared without a clear source. These details were subtle, but they accumulated, gradually altering how the object was perceived. Then came the dreams. The owner reported recurring visions in which the figurine appeared larger than its actual size, standing upright, positioned at a distance but always facing directly toward them. In these dreams, there was no movement, no action, only presence. The same image repeated night after night, creating a sense of familiarity that made it increasingly difficult to ignore. Over time, the dreams began to feel less like imagination and more like continuation, as if something was being carried from one night into the next. When the figurine was passed to another individual, the pattern did not disappear. It changed slightly, but the structure remained. The new owner reported a similar progression. At first, nothing unusual, then a growing discomfort, then disturbances that could not be easily explained. The most striking detail was not the events themselves, but their consistency. Independent accounts describing nearly identical experiences, despite no direct connection between the people involved. Eventually, the figurine was returned to the site where it had originally been found. According to later reports, the disturbances stopped. The environment returned to normal. No further incidents were recorded after that point. That resolution, simple as it seems, is what gives the story its weight, because it suggests that the object itself was not acting alone. Its effect may have depended entirely on being out of place. Skeptics argue that this is a clear example of expectation shaping perception, that once an object is believed to be connected to something ancient or ritualistic, the mind begins to interpret ordinary experiences differently. That explanation is reasonable, but it still leaves a question that is difficult to answer. Why do so many of these stories end the same way? The object is returned, the disturbances stop, and whatever followed it does not follow anymore. If the figurine was only clay shaped and fired thousands of years ago, then removing it should not change anything. So why does putting it back seem to change everything? Top 10. The African Fire Mask. Some objects are not simply connected to ritual, they are built for it. The African fire mask, as it is often described, was never intended to exist outside the environment in which it was created. It was part of ceremonies that involved transformation, protection, and communication with forces that were not meant to be approached casually. Materials, symbols, and design were chosen with purpose, not aesthetics. Every detail had a role, and when those details are separated from the system they belong to, the object does not become neutral. It becomes incomplete. At some point, one of these masks was removed from its original setting and entered the hands of collectors. Like many objects on this list, it was redefined. No longer a functional part of a ritual, it became an artifact, something to be displayed, studied, owned. That shift may seem harmless, but it marked the beginning of a pattern that would repeat in a way that was difficult to ignore. The first reports were tied to physical environments. Rooms where the mask was kept experienced unexplained increases in temperature. Small fires appeared without clear ignition sources. Objects that had not been disturbed began to show signs of heat damage. At first, these incidents were attributed to electrical issues, faulty wiring, or environmental factors. But when the same types of events began appearing in different locations, under different conditions, the explanation became less stable. The details varied, but the structure remained. Heat, fire, damage that did not align with a clear cause. Then the effects became more personal. Owners described intense dreams involving flames, often accompanied by a sensation of heat that felt real even after waking. Some reported waking to the smell of smoke in rooms where nothing had burned. Others experienced sudden anxiety that seemed to center around the presence of the mask itself, as if proximity to the object was enough to trigger a response that could not be easily controlled. These experiences were not dramatic in isolation, but together they formed a pattern that was difficult to separate from the object they were associated with. In several cases, attempts were made to remove or discard the mask. The results were inconsistent, but they followed a familiar structure. The disturbances either continued or intensified. Only when the mask was returned to a setting that resembled its original context did the reports begin to stop. That resolution mirrors what has been seen with other artifacts on this list. Not destruction, not containment, but return. What makes the African fire mask particularly unsettling is that its associated effects align closely with the purpose it once served: fire, transformation, energy, presence. The very elements that defined its role in ritual appear again when it is removed from that role, as if the function has not disappeared, but lost its direction. Skeptics argue that these accounts can be explained through environmental factors, psychological influence, or coincidence. And in many individual cases, that may be true. But across multiple reports, in different places, among people with no connection to one another, the same structure appears again and again. An object is taken. It is placed where it does not belong, and something begins to happen that cannot be easily undone. If the mask is only wood, pigment, and carved form, then it should remain passive, regardless of where it is placed. So why does it seem to behave differently once it is no longer where it was meant to be? And if returning it restores balance, then what exactly was disturbed in the first place? Across all of these artifacts, the details change. Different cultures, different materials, different points in history, but the structure remains the same. Something is taken from where it belongs. It is redefined, displayed, owned, or ignored. And then slowly, something begins to follow. Maybe all of this can be explained. Psychology, coincidence, pattern recognition, or maybe these objects are not dangerous because of what they are, but because of what happens when they are removed from the place they were never meant to leave. Because if every story ends the same way, with the object being returned, then maybe the real question is not whether the curse is real, but why. Across time and across the world, people keep trying to send these things back.